It took me the better part of an hour to make my way across the rooftops. The flickering light of the storm made things harder rather than easier, blinding me for long moments after every flash. Still, I eventually made my limping way to the roof of Maine's, where I typically met Ari. Stiffly, I climbed down the apple tree to the enclosed courtyard. I was about to call down through the heavy metal grating that led to the underthing when I saw a flicker of movement in the shadow of the nearby bushes. I peered into the dark, unable to see anything but a vague shape. "Ari?" I asked gently. "I don't like telling," she said softly, her voice thick with tears. Of all the awful things I'd been part of these last couple days, this was unquestionably the worst of it. "I'm so sorry, Ari," I said. "I won't ask again. I promise." There was a tiny sob from the shadows that froze my heart solid and broke off a piece of it. "What were you doing out on top of things tonight?" I asked. I knew this was a safe question. I'd asked it many times before. "I was looking at the lightning," she said, sniffling. Then, "I saw one that looked like a tree." "What was in the lightning?" I asked softly. "Galvanic ionization," she said. Then after a pause, she added, "And river ice, and the sway a cattail makes." "I wish I'd seen that one," I said. "What were you doing on top of things?" She paused and gave a tiny hiccuping laugh. "All crazy and mostly naked." My heart began to thaw a bit. "I was looking for a place to put my blood," I said. "Most people keep that inside," she said. "It's easier." "I want to keep the rest of it inside," I explained, "but I'm worried someone might be looking for me." "Oh," she said, as if she understood perfectly. I saw the slightly darker shadow of her move in the darkness, standing up. "You should come with me to Clink's." "I don't think I've seen Clink's," I said. "Have you taken me there before?" There was a motion that might have been the shaking of a head. "It's private." I heard a metallic noise, then a rustle. Then I saw a blue-green light well up from the open grate. I climbed down and met her in the tunnel underneath. The light in her hand showed smudges across her face, probably from where she'd been rubbing away her tears. It was the first time I'd ever seen Ari dirty. Her eyes were darker than normal, and her nose was red. Ari sniffed and rubbed her blotchy face. "You," she said gravely, "are a dreadful mess." I looked down at my bloody hands and chest. "I am," I agreed. Then she gave a tiny, brave smile. "I didn't run so far this time," she said, tilting her chin proudly. "I'm glad," I said. "And I'm sorry." "No." She gave her head a tiny, firm shake. "You are my Siride, and thus above reproach." She reached out to touch the center of my bloody chest with a finger. "Iveri enem muge." Ari led me through the maze of tunnels that comprised the underthing. We went farther down, through vaults, past Cricklet. Then we moved through several twisting hallways and down again, using a stone spiral staircase I'd never seen before. I smelled damp stone and heard the low, smooth sound of running water as we descended. Every once in a while, there was the gritty sound of glass on stone, or the brighter tinkling sound of glass on glass. After about 50 steps, the wide, spiraling staircase disappeared into a vast, roiling pool of black water. I wondered how far the stairs continued below the surface. There wasn't any smell of rot or foulness. It was fresh water, and I could see ripples as it swirled in the stairwell and spread out into the dark beyond where our lights could reach. I heard the clink of glass again and saw 2 bottles spinning and bobbing on the surface, moving first one way, then another. One ducked under the surface and didn't come up again. There was a burlap sack hanging from a brass torch bracket mounted into the wall. Ari reached into the bag and pulled out a heavy, stoppered bottle of the sort that might have once held bread and beer. She handed me the bottle. They disappear for an hour, or a minute, sometimes for days. Sometimes they don't come back at all. She brought another bottle out of the sack. It's best to have at least 4 going at once. That way, statistically, you should always have 2 moving around. I nodded and pulled a strand of burlap from the tattered sack and daubed it with the blood that covered my hand. I uncorked the bottle and dropped it inside. Hair too, Ari said. I pulled a few from my head and threaded them through the bottle's mouth. Then I drove the cork in hard and set it floating. It rode low in the water, circling erratically. Ari handed me another bottle, and we repeated the process. When the 4th bottle was swept out into the swirling water, Ari nodded and dusted her hands briskly against each other. There, she said with the tone of immense satisfaction. That's good. We're safe. Hours later, washed, bandaged, and considerably less naked, I made my way to Willem's room in the Mews. That night, and for many to come, Will and Sim took turns watching over me as I slept, keeping me safe with their alar. They were the best sort of friends, the sort everyone hopes for, but no one deserves, least of all me. Chapter 25. Wrongful Apprehension. Despite what Will and Sim believed, I couldn't believe Davy was responsible for the malfeasance against me. While I was painfully aware that I knew next to nothing about women, she had always been friendly to me, even sweet at times. True, she had a grim reputation, but I knew better than anyone how quickly a handful of rumors could turn into full-blown fairy stories. I thought it much more likely that my unknown assailant was simply a bitter student who resented my advancement in the Arcanum. Most students studied for years before they reached Relar, and I had managed it in less than 3 terms. It could even be someone who simply hated the Adema Rue. It wouldn't be the first time that had earned me a beating. In some ways, it really didn't matter who was responsible for the attacks. What I needed was a way to stop them. I couldn't expect Will and Sim to watch over me for the rest of my life. I needed a more permanent solution. I needed a gram. A gram is a clever piece of artificery designed for just this sort of problem. It's a sort of sympathetic armor that prevents anyone from making a binding against your body. I didn't know how they worked, but I knew they existed. And I knew where to find out how to make one. Kilvin looked up as I approached his office. I was relieved to see his glasswork was cold and dark. "I trust you are well, Relar Kvothe?" he asked without getting up from the work table. He was holding a large hemisphere of glass in one hand and a diamond stylus in the other. "I am, Master Kilvin," I lied.
"Have you been thinking about your next project?" he asked. "Have you been dreaming clever dreams?"
I was actually looking for a schema for a gram, Master Kilvin, but I can't find it in any of the bolt holes or reference books. Kilvin looked at me curiously.
"And why would you be needing a gram, Relar Kvothe? Such a desire does not reflect good faith in your fellow Arcanists."
Unsure as to whether he was joking or not, I decided to play it straight. "We've been learning about slippage in Adept Sympathy. I was thinking that if a gram works to deny outside affinities..." Kilvin gave a low chuckle.
"Dal has been throwing fear into you. Good. And you are correct. A gram would help protect against slippage."
His dark sealedish eyes gave me a serious look.
"To a degree. However, it seems a clever student would simply learn his lessons and avoid slippage through proper care and caution."
"I intend to, Master Kilvin," I said. "Still, a gram strikes me as a useful thing to have."
"There is truth to that," Kilvin admitted, nodding his shaggy head. "However, with repairs and the filling of our autumn orders, we are understaffed."
He waved a hand toward the window that looked out into the workshop.
"I cannot spare any workers to make such a thing, and even if I could, there is an issue of cost. They require delicate work, and gold is needed for the inlay."
I'd prefer to make my own, Master Kilvin. Kilvin shook his head.
There is reason the schema is not in the reference books. You are not far enough along to be making your own. One must be careful when meddling with Sigildry and one's own blood.
I opened my mouth to say something, but he cut me off.
More important, the Sigildry necessary for such a device is only entrusted to those who have reached the ranks of Elte. The runes for blood and bone have too great a potential for misuse.
His tone let me know there was nothing to be gained by arguing, so I shrugged it off, as if I couldn't care less. It's no matter, Master Kilvin. I have other projects to occupy my time. Kilvin gave me a wide smile.
I'm sure you do, Relar Kvothe. I am waiting with great eagerness to see what you will make for me.
A thought struck me. To that purpose, Master Kilvin, could I have the use of one of the private workrooms? I'd rather not have everyone looking over my shoulder while I'm tinkering. Kilvin's eyebrows went up at this.
Now I am doubly curious.
He set down the hemisphere of glass, got to his feet, and opened a drawer in his desk.
Will one of the first floor workrooms suit you? Or is there a chance of something exploding? I will give you one on the 3rd floor if that is the case. They are colder, but the roof is better suited for that sort of thing.
I looked at him for a moment, trying to decide if he was joking. A 1st floor room will be fine, Master Kilvin, but I'll need a small smelter and a little extra room to breathe. Kilvin muttered to himself, then brought out a key.
How much breathing will you be doing? Room 27 is 500 feet square.
That should be plenty, I said. I also might need permission to get precious metals from stocks. Kilvin chuckled at this, and nodded as he handed me the key.
I will see it is done, Relar Kvothe. I look forward to seeing what you will make for me.
It was galling that the schema I needed was restricted, but there are always other ways of finding information, and there are always people who know more than they are supposed to. For example, I didn't doubt Manette knew how to make a gram. Everyone knew he was an Elir in title only, but there was no way he would share the information with me against Kilvin's wishes. The university had been Manette's home for 30 years, and he was probably the only student who feared expulsion more than me. This meant my options were limited. Other than a lengthy search of the archives, I couldn't think of any way to get a schema on my own. So, after several minutes of racking my brain for a better option, I made my way to the Bale and Barley. The Bale was one of the more disreputable taverns this side of the river. Anchor's wasn't seedy in the strictest sense. It simply lacked pretension. It was clean without smelling of flowers, and inexpensive without being tawdry. People visited Anchor's to eat, drink, listen to music, and occasionally have a friendly fight. The Bale was several rungs farther down the ladder. It was grubbier, music was not a priority, and the fights were usually only recreational for one of the people involved. Mind you, the Bale wasn't as bad as half the places in Tarbean, but it was the worst you were likely to find this close to the university. So despite being seedy, it had wooden floors and glass in the windows, and if you passed out drunk and woke up missing your purse, you could content yourself with the fact that nobody had knifed you and stolen your boots as well. As it was still early in the day, there were a bare handful of people scattered around the common room. I was glad to see Sleet sitting in the back. I hadn't actually met him, but I knew who he was. I'd heard stories. Sleet was one of the rare, indispensable people who have a knack for arranging things. From what I'd heard, he'd been a student on and off for the last 10 years. He was talking with a nervous-looking man at the moment, and I knew better than to interrupt. So I bought 2 mugs of short beer and made a pretense of drinking one while I waited. Sleet was handsome, dark-haired and dark-eyed. Though he didn't have the characteristic beard, I expected he was at least half Sealdish. His body language screamed authority. He moved as if he were in control of everything around him, which wouldn't have surprised me, actually. He could own the Bale for all I knew. People like Sleet are no strangers to money. Sleet and the anxious young man finally came to some sort of agreement. Sleet smiled warmly as they shook hands and clapped the man on the shoulder as he walked away. I waited for a moment, then made my way over to his table. As I came closer, I noticed there was a stretch of open floor between his table and the others in the common room. It wasn't much, just enough so eavesdropping would be difficult. Sleet looked up as I approached. "I was wondering if we could talk," I said. He made an expansive gesture to the empty chair. "This is a bit of a surprise," he said. "Why's that?" "I don't get a lot of clever folk paying me visits. I get desperate folk." He looked at the mugs. "Are those both for you?" "You can have either or both." I nodded at the one on the right, but I've already had my mouth on that one. He looked at the mugs warily for a fraction of a second, then gave a wide, white smile and took the drink on the left. "From what I've heard, you're not the sort to poison a man." "You seem to know a lot about me," I said. His shrug was so casual, I guessed he'd practiced it. "I know a lot about everyone," he said, "but I know more about you." "Why's that?" Sleet slouched forward, leaning on the table and speaking in a confidential tone. "Do you have any idea how boring your average student is? Half of them are rich tourists who don't care half a damn for their classes." He rolled his eyes and gestured as if throwing something over his shoulder. "The other half are bookish tits who have dreamed of this place so long they can hardly breathe once they're here. They walk on eggshells, meek as priests, scared lest the masters cast a disapproving eye in their direction." He sniffed disdainfully and leaned back in his seat. "Suffice to say, you're a breath of fresh air. Everyone says—" He stopped and gave his practiced shrug again. "Well, you know." "Actually, I don't," I admitted. "What do people say?" Sleet gave me a sharp, beautiful smile. "Ah, that's the problem, isn't it? Everyone knows a man's reputation, except the man himself. For most men, this isn't a bother. But some of us labor over our reputations. I have built mine brick by brick. It is a useful tool." He gave me a sly look. "I expect you understand what I'm talking about." I allowed myself a smile. "Perhaps." "What do they say about me, then? Tell me, and I'll return the favor." "Well," I said. "You're good at finding things," I said. "You're discreet, but expensive." He waved his hands, irritated. "Vagaries. Details are the bones of the story. Give me bones." I thought. "I heard you managed to sell several vials of Regium Ignal Neratum last term, after the fire in Kilvin's shop, where all of it was supposedly destroyed." Sleet nodded, his expression giving away nothing. "I heard you arranged to get a message to Vane's father in Imlan despite the fact that there was a siege going on." Another nod. "You got a young prostitute working in buttons, a set of documents proving she was a distant bloodline cousin of the Baronet Gamry, allowing her to marry a certain young gentleman with minimal fuss." Sleet smiled. "I was proud of that one." "When you were in Elir," I continued, "you were suspended for 2 terms on charges of wrongful apprehension. 2 years later, you were fined and suspended again for misuse of university equipment in the Crucible. I've heard Jameson knows the sort of business you do, but he's paid to turn a blind eye. I don't believe the last one, by the way." "Fair enough," he said easily. "Neither do I." "Despite your extensive activities, you've only been brought up against the Iron Law once," I continued. "Transport of contraband substances, wasn't it?" Sleet rolled his eyes. "You know the damnedest thing? I was actually innocent of that one. Heffron's boys paid off a constable to fake some evidence. The charges were withdrawn after only 2 days." He scowled. "Not that the masters cared."
All they gave a damn about was that I was out there besmirching the university's good name. His tone was bitter. My tuition tripled after that. I decided to push matters a bit. Several months ago, you poisoned a young earl's daughter with venetacin and only gave her the antidote after she signed over the largest of the fiefdoms she stood to inherit. Then, you staged it to look like she'd lost it playing a game of high-stakes faro. He raised an eyebrow at this. Do they say why? No, I said. I assumed she tried to default on her debt to you. There's some truth to that, he said, though it was a bit more complicated. And it wasn't venetacin. That would be extraordinarily reckless. He looked offended and brushed at his sleeve, plainly irritated. Anything else? I paused, trying to decide if I wanted to get confirmation about something I'd suspected for some time. Only that last term you put Ambrose Jackus in touch with a pair of men who have been known to kill people for money. Sleet's expression remained impassive, his body loose and relaxed, but I could see a slight tension in his shoulders. Very little escapes me when I'm watching closely. They say that, do they? I gave a shrug that put his to shame. My shrug was so nonchalant it would make a cat jealous. I'm a musician. I play 3 nights a span in a busy tavern. I hear all manner of things. I reached for my mug. And what have you heard of me? The same stories everyone else knows, of course. You convinced the masters to admit you to the university, though you're just a pup. No offense. Then 2 days later, you shame Master Hem in his own classroom and get away bird-free. Save for a whipping. Save for a whipping, he acknowledged. During which you couldn't be bothered to cry out or bleed, even a little. I wouldn't believe that if there weren't several hundred witnesses. We drew a decent crowd, I said. It was good weather for a whipping. I've heard some overly dramatic folk call you, quoth, the Bloodless because of it, he said. Though, I'm guessing part of that comes from the fact that you're a Demaru, which means you're about as far from a blooded noble as a person can be. I smiled. A bit of both, I expect. He looked thoughtful. I've heard you and Master Elodin fought in Haven. Vast and terrible magics were unleashed, and in the end, he won by throwing you through a stone wall, then off the roof of the building. Do they say what we fought over? I asked. All manner of things, he said dismissively. An insult, a misunderstanding. You tried to steal his magic, he tried to steal your woman. Typical nonsense. Sleet rubbed at his face. Let me see. You play the lute passing well and are proud as a kicked cat. You are unmannerly, sharp-tongued, and show no respect for your betters, which is practically everyone, given your lowly rabble birth. I felt a flush of anger start in my face and sweep, hot and prickling, down the entire length of my body. I am the best musician you will ever meet or see from a distance, I said with forced calm, and I am a Demaru to my bones. That means my blood is red. It means I breathe the free air and walk where my feet take me. I do not cringe and fawn like a dog at a man's title. That looks like pride to people who have spent their lives cultivating supple spines. Sleet gave a lazy smile, and I realized he'd been baiting me. You also have a temper, so I've heard. And there's a whole boatload of other assorted nonsense floating around you as well. You only sleep an hour each night. You have demon blood. You can talk to the dead. I leaned forward, curious. That wasn't one of the rumors I'd started. Really? Do I talk to spirits, or are they claiming I'm digging up bodies? I'm assuming spirits, he said. I haven't heard anyone mention grave robbing. I nodded. Anything else?
Only that you were cornered in an alley last term by two men who kill people for money. And despite the fact that they had knives and caught you quite unaware, you blinded one and beat the other senseless, calling down fire and lightning like Tamerlane the Great. We looked at each other for a long moment. It was not a comfortable silence. Did you put Ambrose in touch with them? I asked at last. That, Sleet said frankly, is not a good question. It implies I discuss private dealings after the fact. He gave me a flat look, no hint of a smile anywhere near his mouth or eyes. Besides, would you trust me to answer honestly? I frowned. I can say, however, that because of those stories, nobody is much interested in taking that sort of job again, Sleet said conversationally. Not that there is much call for that sort of work around here to begin with. We're all terribly civilized. Not that you would know about it, even if it were going on. His smile came back. Exactly. He leaned forward. Enough chatter, then. What is it you're looking for? I need a schema for a piece of artificing. He set his elbows on the table. And? It contains sigildry Kilvin restricts to those of Eltha rank and higher. Sleet nodded matter-of-factly. And how quickly do you need it? Hours? Days? I thought about Will and Sim staying up nights to watch over me. Sooner is better. Sleet looked thoughtful, his eyes unfocused. It's going to cost, and there's no guarantee I'll be able to produce it on an exact schedule. He focused in on me. Also, if you get caught, you'll be charged with wrongful apprehension, at the very least. I nodded. And you know what the penalties are? For wrongful apprehension of the arcane not leading to injury of another, I recited, the offending student may be fined no more than 20 talents, whipped no more than 10 times, suspended from the arcanum, or expelled from the university. They fined me the full 20 talents, and suspended me 2 terms, Sleet said grimly. And that was only some Relar-level alchemy. It will be worse with you if this is Eltha-level stuff. How much? I asked. To get hold of it in a few days? He looked up at the ceiling for a moment. 30 talents. I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach, but I kept my face composed. Is there any room to negotiate that? He gave his sharp smile again. His teeth were very white. I also deal in favors, he said. But a 30-talent favor is going to be a big one. He looked at me thoughtfully. We could perhaps work out something along those lines, but I feel obliged to mention that when I call a favor due, it's due. At that point, there isn't any negotiation. I nodded calmly to show him I understood, but I felt a cold knot forming in my gut. This was a bad idea. I knew it in my bones. Do you owe anyone else? Sleet asked. And don't lie to me or I'll know. 6 talents, I said casually, due at the end of the term. He nodded. I'm guessing you didn't manage to get it off some moneylender. Did you go to Heffron? I shook my head. Davy. For the first time in our conversation, Sleet lost his composure. His charming smile fell away entirely. Davy? He pulled himself up in his chair, his body suddenly tense. No, I don't think we can come to an arrangement. If you had cash, it would be one thing. He shook his head. But no. If Davy already owns a piece of you... His reaction chilled me. Then I realized he was just angling for more money. What if I were to borrow money from you so I could settle my debt with her? Sleet shook his head, regaining a piece of his shattered nonchalance. That is the very definition of poaching, he said. Davy has an ongoing interest in you, an investment. He took a drink and cleared his throat meaningfully. She does not look kindly on other folk interfering where she's staked her claim. I raised an eyebrow. I guess I was taken in by your reputation, I said. Silly of me, really. His face creased into a frown. What do you mean by that? I waved my hands dismissively. Please, give me credit for being at least half as clever as you've heard, I said. If you can't get what I want, just admit it. Don't waste my time by pricing things out of my reach or coming up with elaborate excuses. Sleet seemed unsure if he should be offended. What part of this seems elaborate to you? Come now, I said. You're willing to run against the laws of the university, risk the wrath of the masters, the constables, and the iron law of Atur, but a little slip of a girl makes your knees quivery? I sniffed and mimicked the gesture he'd made before, pretending to ball something up and throw it away over my shoulder. He looked at me for a moment, then burst out laughing.
I literally thought I was live.
Yes, that's exactly the case, he said, wiping tears of genuine amusement from his eyes. Apparently I was fooled by your reputation too. If you think Davy is a little slip of a girl, you aren't nearly as clever as I thought. Looking over my shoulder, Sleet nodded at someone I couldn't see and waved his hand dismissively. Go on with you, he said. I have business to do with rational people who know the true shape of the world. You're wasting my time. I felt myself prickling with irritation, but forced myself to keep it off my face. I also need a crossbow, I said. He shook his head.
This game is
No,
stupid.
I've already told you. No loans or favors. I can offer goods in exchange. He looked at me skeptically. What sort of crossbow?
The Logitech, yes,
Any
sir.
sort, I said.
I did get the Logitech.
It needn't be
Logitech.
fancy.
That's the exact
It just
gear that
needs
I
to
have.
work.
How
8
comfortable? It's
talents,
extremely
he said.
comfortable.
I gave him a hard look. Don't insult me. This is mundane contraband. I'll bet 10 to a penny you can have one in 2 hours. If you try to gouge me, I'll just go over the river and get one from Heffron. Get one from Heffron and you'll have to carry it back from Imre, he said. Constable would love seeing that. I shrugged and began to get to my feet. 3 talents and 5, he said. It'll be used, mind you,
my
and a
posture,
stirrup,
I know you
not a
guys said my
crank.
posture was good when I played, but like
I calculated in my head.
It's pretty bad.
Will you accept an ounce of
now
silver
is
and a
good.
spool of finely drawn gold wire? I asked, bringing them out from the pockets of my cloak. Sleet's dark eyes unfocused slightly as he did his own internal calculations.
What's up, Nice?
You drive a tight bargain. He picked up the spool of bright wire and the small ingot of silver.
I have noticed
There's a
that
rain
it's
barrel
kinda on the
behind the
smaller end.
Grimsome Tannery.
It's a
The
small
crossbow
share.
will be there in 15 minutes. He gave me an insulted look. 2 hours? You don't know anything about me at all. Hours later, Fella emerged from the shelves in the archives and caught me with one hand against the 4-plate door. I wasn't
way I
pushing
didn't
on
copy
it
that.
exactly, just pressing, just checking to see if it was firmly closed. It was.
That chair makes me look like a
I
normal
don't
sized
suppose they
person.
tell Scribs what's behind this,
Dude, this chair makes
I
me
asked her
tall as
without any
fuck.
hope. If they do, they haven't told me yet, Fella said, stepping close and reaching out to run her fingers along the grooves the letters made in the stone. Valeritas.
This
I had a
chair
dream
actually- I
about
have
the
to,
door
like,
once,
raise my-
she said.
I have to, like, raise
Valeritas
my
was the
camera
name
angle
of an old dead
by, like,
king.
a lot.
His tomb was behind the door.
Look like
Wow,
I'm levitating? That's what I mean.
I said. That's better than the dreams I have about it. What are yours? She asked.
A lot.
Once, I dreamed I saw a light through the keyholes, I said. But mostly, I'm just standing here, staring at it, trying to get in. I frowned at the door. As if standing outside while I'm awake isn't frustrating enough. I do it while I'm asleep, too. Fella laughed softly at that, then turned away from the door to face me. I got your note, she said. What's the research project you were so vague about? Let's go somewhere private to talk, I said. It's a bit of a story. We made our way to one of the reading holes, and once the door was closed, I told her the whole story, embarrassments and all. Someone was practicing malfeasance against me. I couldn't go to the masters for fear of revealing I was the one who had broken into Ambrose's rooms. I needed a gram to protect myself, but I didn't know enough sigildry to make
chair
one.
Yet? No, I didn't. It's really hard to show it off, because it's like I said, it's a tiny-ass chair.
Malfeasance, she said in a low voice, slowly shaking her head in dismay. You're sure? I unbuttoned my shirt and took it down off my shoulder, revealing the dark bruise on my shoulder from the attack I'd only managed to partially stop.
Done.
She leaned in to look at it. And you really don't know who it might be? Not really, I said, trying not to think of Davy.
Am I officially on a team?
I wanted to
I'm not
keep
officially
that
on
particular
any
bad
team.
decision to myself for now. I'm sorry to drag you into this,
chair?
but
It's
you're
not
the only
3K,
one.
it was like
Bella
2
waved her
points
hands in negation. None of that.
Like two and a
I
half.
told you to ask if you
Canadian?
ever needed a favor, and I'm glad you did. I'm glad you're glad, I said. If you can get me through this, I'll owe you instead.
Hey, God,
I'm
I
getting
got
better
a
at
chair,
finding
dude.
what I
did.
want in
You're
here,
bad.
but I'm still new. Fella nodded. It takes years to
thing I
learn
do
your way
miss
around the
is, like,
stacks.
how tall it
It's
was.
like a city.
My old chair had like
I smiled.
like a headrest.
That's how I think of it, too. I haven't lived here long enough to learn all the shortcuts.
I'm gonna
Fella
miss that.
grimaced a bit.
I'm gonna miss
And
that,
I'm guessing
for sure.
you're going to need those. If Kilvin really believes the sigildry is dangerous, most of the books you want will be in his private library. I felt a sinking sensation in my stomach. Private library? All the masters have private libraries,
What kind of chair
Fella
is it?
said matter-of-factly.
Herman Miller Logitech.
I know some
Eight
alchemy,
body.
so I help spot books with formulae Mandrag wouldn't want in the wrong
You
hands.
don't want my old one, bro. My
Scribs
old
who
one
know
was
sigildry do the
shit.
same for Kilvin.
I wouldn't even
But
give
this
that
is
shit away for
pointless
free.
then, I said. If Kilvin has all those books locked away, there's no chance of finding what I'm looking for. Bella smiled, shaking her head. The system isn't perfect. Only about a third of the archives
I
are
wouldn't even
properly
give my old
cataloged.
chair away to, like,
What you're looking for is
I just
probably
wouldn't
still
give
in the
it
stacks
away.
somewhere.
It's so bad.
It's just a matter of finding it.
You
I
guys
wouldn't
don't know
even
it,
need a whole
but
schema,
it
I
literally
said.
isn't too.
If I just knew a few of the proper runes, I could probably just fake the rest. She gave me a worried look. Is that really wise? Wisdom is a luxury I can't afford, I said. Will and Sim have already been watching over me for 2 nights. They can't sleep in shifts for the next 10 years. Bella drew a deep breath, then let it out slowly. Right. We can start with the cataloged books first. Maybe what you need has slipped past the scribs. We collected several dozen books on sigildry and closeted ourselves in an out-of-the-way reading hole on the 4th floor. Then we started going through them one at a time. We began with hopes of finding a full-fledged schema for a gram, but as the hours slid by, we lowered our hopes. If not a whole schema,
making this man
perhaps
beef?
we could find a description of one, perhaps a reference to the sequence of runes used, the name of a single rune, a hint, a clue, a scrap, some piece of the puzzle. I closed the last of the books we had brought back to the reading hole. It made a solid thump as the pages settled together. Nothing?
New chair, dude, that's
She
what I'm
asked
saying.
tiredly.
I was in
Nothing.
need of a new chair
I
for
rubbed
quite a
my
long
face
time.
with both hands. So much for getting lucky. Fella shrugged, grimacing halfway through the motion,
now? That's what
then
I'm saying.
craned
You guys
her
thought I had
head
good
to
posture
one
before.
side to stretch
Really,
a
I was
kink out of her
slouching.
neck. It made
I was
sense to
really
start in the most
slouched before.
obvious places, she said. But those will be the same places the scribs have combed over for Kilvin. We'll just have to dig deeper.
What's up, Claudia?
I heard the distant sound of the belling tower and was surprised at how many times it struck. We'd been researching for over 4 hours.
Listen, the reason why I went for
You've
the
missed your class,
an
I said.
expensive ergonomic
It's just
chair
geometries,
because,
she
one,
said. You're a
everybody
wonderful
was
person, I
recommending
said.
it. Everybody was recommending
What's
it.
our best option now?
2,
A long, slow
all day.
trawl of the
all
stacks,
day,
she said.
every day.
But it's going to be like panning for gold.
Seems like,
Dozens
you know,
of
if I'm gonna
hours,
spend
and
money on
that's
something,
with both
it
of
might
us
as well
working
be a chair
together
that,
so we don't overlap our efforts.
You know, it might as well be a chair.
I can
that
bring
I'm
in
gonna
Will
sit
and Sim to help,
10
I
hours.
said. Willem works here, Bella said. But Simmons never been a
actually
scriv.
Dude,
He'll
I've been trying to tell you
probably
guys,
just
I'm
get in the
actually tall,
way.
I swear.
I gave her an odd look. Do you know Sim very well? Not very, she admitted. I've seen him around. You're underestimating him, I said. People do it all the time. Sim's smart. Everyone here is smart, Bella said. And Sim is nice, but that's the problem, I said. He's nice. He's gentle, which people see as weak. And he's happy, which people see as stupid. I didn't mean it like that. Fella said. I know, I said, rubbing at my face. I'm sorry. It's been a bad couple of days. I thought the university would be different than the rest of the world, but it's just like everywhere else. People cater to pompous, rude bastards like Ambrose, while the good souls like Simon get brushed off as simpletons. Which one are you? Fella said with a smile as she began to stack up the books. Pompous bastard or good soul? I'll research that later, I said. Right now, I've got more pressing concerns. Chapter 26. Trust. While I was fairly sure Davy wasn't behind the malfeasance, I'd have to be a fool to ignore the fact that she had my blood. So, when it became clear that making a gram was going to require a great deal of time and energy, I realized the time had come to pay her a visit and make sure she wasn't responsible. It was a miserable day, chill with a clammy wind that cut through my clothes. I didn't own gloves or a hat, and had to settle for putting up my hood and wrapping my hands in the fabric of my cloak as I pulled it more tightly around my shoulders. As I crossed Stonebridge, a new thought occurred to me. Maybe someone had stolen my blood from Davy. That made better sense than anything else. I needed to make sure the bottle with my blood was safe. If she still had it, and it hadn't been tampered with, I'd know she wasn't involved. I made my way to the western edge of Imre, where I stopped at a tavern to buy a small beer and warm myself by their fire. Then, I walked through the now familiar alley and up the narrow staircase behind the butcher's shop. Despite the chill and recent rain, the smell of rancid fat still hung in the air. I took a deep breath and knocked on the door. It opened after a minute. Then Davy's face peered through a narrow crack in the door. "Well, hello," she said. "Are you here for business or pleasure?" "Business, mostly," I admitted. "Pity." She opened the door wider. As I came into the room, I tripped on the threshold, stumbling clumsily into her and resting one hand briefly on her shoulder as I steadied myself. "Sorry," I said, embarrassed. "You look like hell," she said as she bolted the door. "I hope you're not looking for more money. I don't lend to folks who look like they're coming off a 3-day drunk." I settled wearily into a chair. "I brought back your book," I said, bringing it out from under my cloak and laying it on her desk. She nodded at it, smiling a bit. "What did you think of good old Malkath?" "Dry, wordy, boring. There weren't any pictures either," she said dryly, "but that's beside the point. His theories about perception as an active force were interesting," I admitted, "but he writes like he's afraid someone might actually understand him." Davy nodded, her mouth pursed. "That's about what I thought, too." She reached across the desk and slid the book closer to herself. "What did you think about the chapter on proprioception?" "He seemed to be arguing from a deep well of ignorance," I said. "I've met people in the Medica with amputated limbs. I don't think Malkath ever has." I watched her for some sign of guilt, some indication she'd been practicing malfeasance against me. But there was nothing. She seemed perfectly normal, cheery, and sharp-tongued as ever. But I had grown up among actors. I know how many ways there are to hide your true feelings. Davy made an exaggerated frown. "You look so serious over there. What are you thinking?" "I had a couple of questions," I said evasively. I wasn't looking forward to this. "Not about Malkath. I'm so tired of being appreciated for my intellect." She leaned back and stretched her arms over her head. "When will I be able to find a nice boy who just wants me for my body?"
I hope you like some crypto.
She gave a luxurious stretch, but stopped halfway through, giving me a puzzled look.
Crazy.
"I'm waiting for a quip here. You're usually quicker than this." I gave her a weak smile. "I've got a lot on my mind. I don't think I can match wits with you today." "I never suspected you could match wits with me," she said. "But I do like a little banter now and then." She leaned forward and folded her hands on the top of the desk. "What sort of questions?" "Did you do much sigildry in the university?"
This chair is crazy.
"Personal questions." She raised an eyebrow. "No, I didn't care for it. Too much fiddling around for my taste."
So far,
You don't seem to be the sort of woman who'd mind a little fiddling around, I said, managing a weak smile. That's more like it, she said with approval. I knew you had it in you. I don't suppose you have any books on advanced sigildry, I asked. The sort of things they don't allow a Relar access to. Davy shook her head. No. I've got some nice alchemical texts, though. Stuff you'd never find in your precious archives. Bitterness was thick in her voice when she said the last word. That's when it all came together in my head. Davy wouldn't ever be so careless as to let someone steal my blood. She wouldn't sell it to turn a quick profit. She didn't need the money. She didn't have a grudge against me. But Davy would sell her eye teeth to get into the archives. It's funny you should mention alchemy, I said as calmly as possible. Have you ever heard of something called a plumb bob? I've heard of it, she said easily. Nasty little thing. I think I have the formula. She turned in her seat a little, facing toward the shelf. You interested in seeing it? Her face didn't betray her, but with enough practice, anyone can control their face. Her body language didn't give her away either. There was only the slightest tension in her shoulders, only a hint of hesitation. It was her eyes. When I mentioned the plumb bob, I saw a flicker there. Not just recognition. Guilt. Of course. She'd sold the formula to Ambrose. And why wouldn't she? Ambrose was a high-ranking scriv. He could sneak her into the archives. Hell, with the resources at his disposal, he might not even have to do that. Everyone knew Lauren occasionally granted non-Arcanum scholars access to the archives, especially if their patrons were willing to pave the way with a generous donation. Ambrose had once bought an entire inn just to spite me. How much more would he be willing to pay to get hold of my blood? No. Will and Sim had been right about that. Ambrose wasn't the sort to get his hands dirty if he could avoid it. Much simpler for him to hire Davy to do his dirty work for him. She'd already been expelled. She had nothing to lose, and all the secrets of the archives to gain. No thanks, I said. I don't do much alchemy. I took a deep breath and decided to jump right to the point. But I do need to see my blood.
I'm like day 4
Davy's cheery expression froze on her face. Her mouth still smiled, but her eyes were cold. I beg your pardon?
Again, I think my tolerance for
it wasn't really a question.
Pretty high.
I need to see the blood I left here with you, I said. I need to know it's safe.
That makes sense.
I'm afraid that's not possible. Her smile fell completely away, and her mouth made a thin, flat line. That's not how I do business. Besides, do you think I'd be stupid enough to keep that sort of thing here?
So the other times that I quit caffeine, it literally took me a week.
I felt a sinking sensation in my gut, still not wanting to believe it.
So
we can go to wherever you keep it, I said calmly. Someone has been conducting malfeasance against me. I need to make sure it hasn't been tampered with, that's all. As if I would just show you where I keep that sort of thing, Davy said with scathing sarcasm. Have you been struck in the head or something? I'm afraid I must insist. Go ahead and be afraid, Davy said with a glare. Go ahead and insist. It won't make any difference. It was her. There was no other reason for her to keep it from me. If you refuse to show me, I continued, trying to keep my voice level and calm, I must assume you've sold my blood, or made your own moment of me for some reason. Davy leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms with deliberate nonchalance. You can assume whatever stupid thing pleases you. You'll see your blood when you settle your debt with me, and not one moment sooner.
I killed one.
I brought out a wax doll from underneath my cloak and rested my hand on the desk so she could see it. Is that supposed to be me? She said, with hips like that? But the words were just the shell of a joke, a reflex action. Her tone was flat and angry. Her eyes were hard. With my other hand, I brought out a short strawberry blonde hair and fixed it to the doll's head. Davy's hand went unconsciously to her own hair. Her expression shocked. Someone has been attacking me, I said. I need to make sure my blood is... This time, when I mentioned my blood, I saw her eyes flicker to one of her desk drawers. Her fingers twitched slightly. I met her eye. Don't, I said grimly. Davy's hand darted to the drawer, yanking it open. I didn't doubt for a second that the drawer held the mommet she'd made of me. I couldn't let her get hold of it. I concentrated and murmured a binding. Davy's hand came to a jarring halt halfway to the open drawer. I hadn't done anything to hurt her. No fire, no pain, nothing like what she'd done to me over the last several days. It was just a binding to keep her motionless. When I'd stopped at the tavern to warm myself, I'd taken a pinch of ash from their fireplace. It wasn't a great source, and it was farther away than I'd like, but it was better than nothing. Still, I could probably only hold her like this for a few minutes before I drew so much heat from the fire that I extinguished it. But that should be enough time for me to get the truth out of her and reclaim the mommet she'd made. Davy's eyes grew wild as she struggled to move. "How dare you!" she shouted. "How dare you!" "How dare you!" I spat back angrily. "I can't believe I trusted you. I defended you to my friends." I trailed off as the unthinkable happened. Despite my binding, Davy started to move, her hand inching its way into the open drawer. I concentrated harder, and Davy's hand came to a halt. Then slowly, it began to creep forward again, disappearing into the drawer. I couldn't believe it. "You think you can come in here and threaten me?" Davy hissed, her face a mask of rage. "You think I can't take care of myself? I made Relar before they threw me out, you little slipstick. I earned it. My Alar is like the ocean in storm." Her hand was almost completely inside the drawer now. I felt a clammy sweat break out across my forehead and broke my mind 3 more times. I murmured again, and each piece of my mind made a separate binding, focusing on keeping her still. I drew heat from my body, feeling the cold crawl up my arms as I bore down on her. That was 5 bindings in all, my outside limit. Davy went motionless as stone, and she chuckled deep in her throat, grinning. "Oh, you're very good. I almost believe the stories about you now. But what makes you think you can do what even Elxadal couldn't? Why do you think they expelled me? They feared a woman who could match a master by her 2nd year." Sweat made her pale hair cling to her forehead. She clenched her teeth, her pixie face savage with determination. Her hand began to move again. Then, with a sudden burst of motion, she yanked her hand out of the drawer, as if pulling it free from thick mud. She slammed something round and metallic down on the top of the desk, making the lamp's flame leap and stutter. It wasn't a mommet. It wasn't a bottle of my blood. "You bastard," she said, almost chanting the words. "You think I'm not ready for this sort of thing? You think you're the first to try and take advantage of me?" She twisted the top of the gray metal sphere. It gave a distinct click, and she drew her hand slowly away. Despite my best efforts, I couldn't keep her still. That's when I recognized the device she'd brought out of the drawer. I'd studied them with Manette last term. Kilvin referred to them as self-contained exothermic accelerators, but everyone else called them pocket warmers, or poor boys. They held kerosene, or naphtha, or sugar. Once activated, a poor boy burned the fuel inside, pouring out as much heat as a forge fire for about 5 minutes. Then it needed to be dismantled, cleaned, and refilled. They were messy and dangerous, and tended to break easily because of the rapid heating and cooling. But for a short time, they gave a sympathist a bonfire's worth of energy. I lowered myself into the heart of stone, and splintered off another piece of my mind, murmuring the binding. Then I tried for a 7th, and failed. I was tired, and I hurt. The cold was leaching up my arms, and I had been through so much in the last few days. But I clenched my teeth and forced myself to murmur the words under my breath. Davy didn't even seem to notice the 6th binding. Moving as slowly as the hand of a clock, she pulled a loose thread free from her sleeve. The poor boy made a groaning, metallic creak, and heat began to roll off it in shimmering waves. "I don't have a decent link to you right now," Davy said, as the hand holding the thread moved slowly back toward the poor boy. "But if you don't loose your binding, I'll use this to burn every scrap of clothing off your body and smile while you scream." It's strange what thoughts flash into your head in these situations. The first thing I thought of wasn't being horribly burned. It was that the cloak fella had given me would be ruined, and I'd be left with only 2 shirts. My eyes darted to the top of Davy's desk, where the varnish was already starting to blister in a ring around the poor boy. I could feel the heat radiating against my face. I know when I'm beaten. I broke the bindings, my mind reeling as the pieces slid back together. Davy rolled her shoulders. "Let go of it," she said. I opened my hand, and the wax doll toppled drunkenly onto the desk. I sat with my hands in my lap and remained very still, not wanting to startle or threaten her in any way. Davy stood up and leaned across the desk. She reached out and ran a hand through my hair, then made a fist, tearing some away. I yelped despite myself. Sitting back down, Davy picked up the doll and replaced her hair with several of my own. She muttered a binding. "Davy, you don't understand," I said. "I just needed to—" When I had bound Davy, I had focused on her arms and legs. It was the most efficient way to restrain someone. I had limited heat to work with and couldn't waste energy on anything else. But Davy had heat to spare right now, and her binding was like being shut in an iron vice. I couldn't move my arms or legs or jaw or tongue. I could barely breathe, only taking tiny, shallow breaths that didn't require any movement of my chest. It was horrifying, like having someone's hand around my heart.
They have a knock, by the way.
"I trusted you." Davy's voice was low and rough, like a fine-toothed surgeon's saw cutting away an amputated leg. "I trusted you." She gave me a look that was pure fury and loathing. "I actually had someone come here looking to buy your blood.
I'm gonna try to
55 talents. I turned him away. I denied even knowing you because you and I had a business relationship. I stick to the bargains I make." "Who?" I wanted to shout, but I could only make an inarticulate sound. Davy looked at the wax doll she held, then at the poor boy charring a dark ring into the top of her desk. "Our business relationship is now over," she said tightly. "I'm calling your debt due. You have until the end of the term to get me my money. 9 talents. If you are 1/2 breath late, I will sell your blood to recover my investment and wash my hands of you." She eyed me coldly. "This is better than you deserve. I still have your blood. If you go to the masters at the university or the constable in Imre, it will end badly for you." Smoke was curling up from the desk now, and Davy moved her hand to hold the mommet over the creaking metal of the poor boy. She murmured, and I felt a prickle of heat wash over my whole body. It felt exactly like the sudden fevers that had been plaguing me for days. "When I release this binding, you will say, 'I understand, Davy.' Then you will leave. At the end of the term, you will send someone with the money you owe. You will not come yourself. I do not ever want to see you again." Davy looked at me with such contempt that I cringed to remember it. Then she spat on me, tiny flecks of saliva striking the poor boy and hissing into steam.
Dude,
"If I glimpse you again, even out of the corner of my eye, it will end badly for you." She lifted the wax mommet over her head, then brought it down sharply on the desk with her hand flat on top of it. If I'd been able to flinch or cry out in panic, I would have. The mommet shattered, arms and legs breaking away, the head skittering off to roll across the desk and onto the floor. I felt a sudden, jarring impact, as if I'd fallen several feet and landed flat on a stone floor. It was startling, but nowhere near as bad as it could have been. Through the terror, some small part of me marveled at her precision and control. The binding that held me fell away, and I drew a deep breath. "I understand, Davy," I said, "but Get out!" she shouted. I got out. I would like to say it was a dignified exit, but that would not be the truth.
Oh, shit.
I can't even see this guy.
Chapter 27. Pressure. Will and Sim were waiting for me in the back corner of Anchor's. I brought over 2 mugs of beer and a tray laden with fresh bread and butter, cheese and fruit, and bowls of hot soup thick with beef and turnip. Willem rubbed one eye with the palm of his hand. He looked a little peaked under his dark Sealdish complexion, but other than that, he didn't seem much the worse for 3 nights of short sleep.
What's the occasion?
I just want to help you two keep your energy up, I said. Way ahead of you, Sim said. I had a refreshing nap during my sublimation lecture. His eyes were a little dark around the edges, but he didn't seem much the worse for wear either.
You not hit him?
Willem began to load up his plate.
You mentioned you had news. What sort of news?
It's mixed, I said. Which do you want first? Good or bad? Bad news first, Simmons said. Kilvin won't give me the plans I need to make my own gram. It's the Sigildry involved. Runes for blood and bone and such. He feels they're too dangerous to be taught to Relar. Simon looked curious. Did he say why? He didn't, I admitted. But I can guess. I could use them to make all manner of unpleasant things, like a little metal disc with a hole in it. Then, if you put a drop of someone's blood in it, you could use it to burn them alive. God, that's awful, Sim said, setting down his spoon. Do you ever have any nice thoughts?
Surprised me.
Anyone in the Arcanum could do the same thing with basic sympathy,
Willem pointed out. There's a big difference, I said. Once I made that device, anyone could use it, again and again. That's insane, Simon said. Why would anyone make anything like that?
Money,
Willem said grimly.
People do stupid things for money all the time.
He gave me a significant look.
Such as borrowing from bloodthirsty Getesers.
Which brings me to my second piece of news, I said uncomfortably. I confronted Davy.
Gain more RP.
Alone? Simon said. Are you stupid? Yes, I said, but not for the reasons you think. Things got unpleasant, but now I know she wasn't responsible for the attacks. Willem frowned.
If not her, then who?
There's only one thing that makes sense, I said. It's Ambrose. Will shook his head.
We've already gone through this. Ambrose would never risk it.
I held up a hand to stop him. He'd never risk malfeasance against me, I agreed. But I don't think he knows who he's attacking. Willem closed his mouth and looked thoughtful. I continued. Think about it. If Ambrose suspected it was me, he'd bring me up on charges in front of the masters. He's done it before. I rubbed my wounded arm. They'd discover my injuries, and I'd be caught. Will looked down at the tabletop.
Graham,
he said.
It makes sense. He might suspect you of hiring a thief, but not that you'd break in yourself. He'd never do something like that.
I nodded. He's probably trying to find the person who broke into his rooms, or just get a little easy revenge. That explains why the attacks have been getting stronger. He probably thinks the thief ran off to Imre or Tarbean. We've got to go to the masters with this, Simmons said. They can search his rooms tonight. He'll be expelled for this and whipped. A wide, vicious grin spread over his face. God, I'd pay 10 talents if I got to hold the lash. I chuckled at his bloodthirsty tone. It took a lot to get on Sim's bad side, but once you made it, there was no going back. We can't, Sim.
What's up, Alpha?
Sim gave me a look of sheer disbelief. You can't be serious. He can't get away with this. I'd get expelled for breaking into his rooms in the first place. Conduct unbecoming. They wouldn't expel you for that, Sim said, but his voice was far from certain. I'm not willing to take the risk, I said. Hem hates me. Brandur follows Hem's lead. I'm still in Lauren's bad books.
And somehow he still finds the strength to pawn,
Willem muttered. That's 3 votes against me right there.
I think you don't give Lauren enough credit,
Willem said.
But you're right. They'd expel you. If for no other reason, they do it to smooth things over with Baron Jackus. Sim looked at Willem. You really think so? Will nodded. It's possible they wouldn't even expel Ambrose, he said grimly. He's Hem's favorite, and the masters know the trouble his father could make for the university. Will snorted. Think of the trouble Ambrose could make when he inherits. Willem lowered his eyes and shook his head. I'm with Kvothe on this one, Sim. Simon gave a great weary sigh. Wonderful, he said. Then he looked up at me with narrow eyes. I told you, he said. I told you to leave Ambrose alone from the very beginning. Getting into a fight with him is like stepping into a bear trap. A bear trap? I said thoughtfully. He nodded firmly. Your foot goes in easy enough, but you're never getting it out again. A bear trap, I repeated. That's exactly what I need. Willem chuckled darkly. I'm serious, I said. Where can I get a bear trap? Will and Sim looked at me strangely, and I decided not to push my luck. Just a joke, I lied, not wanting to complicate things any further. I could find one on my own. We need to be sure it's Ambrose, Willem said. I nodded. If he's locked away in his rooms the next few times I'm attacked, that should be evidence enough.
No, I don't think he did.
The conversation lapsed a bit, and for a couple of minutes we ate quietly, each of us tangled in our own thoughts. Okay, Simon said, seeming to have reached some conclusion. Nothing's really changed. You still need a gram, right? He looked at Will, who nodded, then back to me. Now hurry up with the good news before I kill myself. I smiled. Fella has agreed to help me search the archives for the schema. I gestured toward the two of them. If the two of you care to join us, it will mean long, grueling hours in close contact with the most beautiful woman this side of the Omethi River. I might be able to spare some time, Willem said casually. Simon grinned. Thus began our search of the archives. Surprisingly, it was fun at first, almost like a game. The four of us would scatter to different sections of the archives, then return and comb through the books as a group. We spent hours chatting and joking, enjoying the challenge and one another's company. But as hours turned into days of fruitless searching, the excitement burned away, leaving only a grim determination. Will and Sim continued to watch over me at night, protecting me with their alar. Night after night, they lost sleep, making them sullen and irritable. I cut my sleep down to 5 hours a night to make things easier for them. Under ordinary circumstances, 5 hours of sleep would be a great plenty for me, but I was still recovering from my injuries. What's more, I needed to constantly maintain the alar that kept me safe. It was mentally exhausting. On the third day of our search, I nodded off while studying my metallurgy. I only dozed for half a minute before my head lolled, startling me awake. But the icy fear followed me for the rest of the day. If Ambrose had attacked at that moment, I could have been killed. So, even though I couldn't afford it, I began dipping into my thinning purse to buy coffee. Many of the inns and cafes near the university catered to noble tastes, so it was readily available. But coffee is never cheap. Nalrout would have been less expensive, but it had harsher side effects that I didn't want to risk. In between bouts of research, we set about confirming my suspicions that Ambrose was responsible for the attacks. In this, if nothing else, we were lucky. Will watched Ambrose return to his room after his rhetoric lecture, and at the same time, I was forced to stave off Binder's chills. Fella watched him finish a late lunch and return to his rooms, and a quarter hour later, I felt a sweaty prickle of heat along my back and arms. Later that evening, I watched him head back to his rooms in the Golden Pony after his shift in the archives. Not long after, I felt the faint pressure in both my shoulders that let me know he was trying to stab me. After the shoulders, there followed several other prods in a more personal area. Will and Sim agreed that it couldn't be coincidence. It was Ambrose. Best of all, it let us know that whatever Ambrose was using against me, he kept it in his rooms. Chapter 28. Kindling. The attacks weren't particularly frequent, but they came with no warning.
On the 5th day after we started searching for the schema, when Ambrose must have been feeling particularly cussed or bored, there were 8 of them. 1 as I was waking up in Willem's room, 2 during lunch, 2 while I was studying physiognomy in the Medica, then 3 in quick succession while I was goldsmithing iron in the fishery. The next day, there were no attacks at all. In some ways, that was worse. Nothing but hours of waiting for the other shoe to drop.
I hit him, he's really weak.
So I learned to maintain an iron-hard alar as I ate and bathed, as I attended class and had conversations with my teachers and friends. I even maintained it while dueling in adept sympathy. On the 7th day of our search, this distraction and my general exhaustion led to my first defeat at the hands of 2 of my classmates, ending my perfect string of undefeated duels. I could say that I was too weary to care, but that wouldn't be entirely true. On the 9th day of our search, Willem, Simon, and I were combing through books in our reading hole when the door opened and Fella slipped inside.
Did he kill them all?
She was carrying a single book instead of her usual arm load. She was breathing heavily. "I've got it," she said, her eyes bright. Her voice so excited it was almost fierce. "I found a copy." She thrust the book out at us so we could read the gold leaf on the thick leather spine. Pasimoen vi Scrivani. We had learned about the Scrivani early in our search. It was an extensive collection of schemata by a long-dead artificer named Surther. 12 thick volumes of detailed diagrams and descriptions. When we found the index, we thought our search was nearly finished, as it listed diagrams detailing the construction of a marvelous 5-gram, proven most efficacious in the preventing of malfeasant sympathy. Location, Volume 9, page 82. We tracked down 8 versions of the Scrivani in the archives, but we never found the whole set. Volumes 7, 9, and 11 were always missing, no doubt tucked away in Kilvin's private library. We'd spent 2 entire days searching before finally giving up on the Scrivani. But now Fella had found it. Not just a piece of the puzzle, but the whole thing. "Is it the right one?" Simon asked, his voice a mixture of excitement and disbelief.
Oh, I didn't get shot.
I can kill.
Did you see the Telepathy again?
I think he just died. We can kill these guys in the building.
Okay. We're on the front. Waiting for you. I'm gonna